born yesterday on December 9th at about 10 to 6. He was 5 pounds, 8 ounces, and he was about 18 and a half inches long. And I just wanted to take a quick moment to tell you a little bit about our story and how we kind of got to this place of finally getting to meet this dude. It's been an interesting journey and one that maybe you can relate to, but more importantly, if you're trusting God for a promise, if you're waiting for him to fulfill a promise, if you're struggling to believe that he's actually going to do what he said he was going to do, I want to encourage you, because this guy right here is proof that what God says he does. And so we've been trying to have kids for about 8 years. We've been married for 10. And during that time, we didn't know why we weren't able to have kids. We just knew that we weren't able to. We did different tests. We went to the doctors, tried to figure out what was going on. And everybody said, we don't know what the problem is, but you're not having kids. We don't know why. And so we got to the point of where we just had to trust God and believe. I've always believed that God told me that I would have children. When I was 12, I had a dream of my son, and his name was Asher, and so I've always held on to that name. And so it's been a long time of trusting God and believing that he was going to give me a son. As far as knowing specifically when that was going to be, we didn't really know that for a long time. In fact, we had many people who would come and who would say, this is when you're going to have kids. This is what we see. This is what we were praying about. And that's awesome. Those people were wonderful, but it never felt like it stuck. Never felt like God was saying, yeah, you need to pay attention to that. But on November 18th of last year, I was working downstairs and I was remodeling our basement. And I was listening to a message by Chris Valentin, and he said, before he started preaching, he said, I just feel like God's telling me I need to tell you, if you're trying to have kids and you're here, I want you to stand up. He said, if you're listening, I want you to stop what you're doing. And he said, I just feel like God's saying that this is your year. And normally I wouldn't have paid much attention to that, because we've heard stuff like that for so long, and especially since it was a message I was listening to. But all of a sudden I just felt electricity go up and down my spine. I felt goosebumps on goosebumps. I just felt like Holy Spirit was saying, you need to pay attention to that. And so I stopped what I was doing. I just began to pray, and I'm like, God, is this you? Are you really telling me right now that this is the year? It's been such a long wait. Don't tell me something. Don't get my hopes up. And I'm sure like if you've been in the same situation, you probably felt that way. And so we continued doing what I was doing, and as I continued to work, I felt like Holy Spirit was saying, not only that, but by faith, I want you to turn that extra room upstairs into a nursery. And so I didn't say anything right away. I wanted to see if God was going to confirm his word to anybody else or through anybody else. I didn't even tell Tenielle. I just kind of kept it between me and God. And 2 weeks later, we were at my brother's church in Vancouver, and he was preaching a message about trusting God and making room for the promises of God. And towards the end of one of his points, he said, if God is telling you that he wants to give you something or do something in your life, make room for it. If you're needing financial provision, then, start to be generous and give. And he named several different things. And then at the end, he said, and if you're asking God for a child, turn that extra room into a nursery. Well, that was all the confirmation that I needed, and so we got in the car afterwards, and I told Tenielle, I said, okay, this is what God said, and this is what I believe is going to happen in the coming year. And so we got excited. We started thinking about, what the nursery was going to be like and what we were going to do to get that ready. 2 weeks after that, it was about December 18th or 19th, someplace in there, and I walked inside the living room, and Tenielle fell to her knees and started crying out in pain. And we didn't know what was going on. It was a surprise. It was a shock. And so we got her into the ER. And over the next few hours, they did some different exams and tried to find out what was going on and what was causing this terrible pain that she was having. And came to find out that she had had a cyst that had ruptured in her stomach. And at first, they didn't think it was going to be a big deal. They were going to send her home with some pain meds. But then the more that they kind of waited and watched and checked some things out, they realized it was a bigger deal than what they thought. And so they took her into the into the operating room the next morning and did some exploratory surgery, and they came to find out that she needed to have an ovary removed and that she had severe endometriosis. And so that kind of scared us. I was a little bit frustrated because I thought, God, this is what you said. And now this is going on. And so what in the world is happening? And continued to feel just peace and felt his presence, but certainly didn't know what was going on. And so we waited for the doctor to come and talk to us about what he had done and why he had done it. And so he finally came in the room and he looked at us and he told us, he kind of explained the procedure and what had happened, that he had to go in and clean out, her system, and that she had to have an ovary removed and all about the endometriosis. But he said, do you guys have kids? And we said, no. And he said, have you been trying to have kids? And we said, yeah, for, at that point, about 7 years. And he said, well, this is the reason why. And he said, but what I did is I went in, I cleaned up everything, I gave her system a reset. And he said, now, because of all of this, he said, you should be cleared up to get pregnant in no time. He said, within the next few months, I'd be surprised if you don't get pregnant. And so we went home, she began to recover, and I began working on the nursery and getting things ready for that. And then I had to have carpal tunnel surgery. And so I had to take a break from working on the nursery. I had gotten quite a bit done, but certainly not everything. And so we took a break from that. And of course, we were trying to have the child, throughout those next few months. We were seeing Tenielle's OBGYN, and we were in conversation with her, and she was very supportive and really excited for us. And she said, I give you guys about 4 months. She said, but because of the endometriosis and the possibility of it coming back, if at the end of 4 months you guys aren't pregnant, then we need to start looking at a fertility specialist. But we're going to need to get her on a pregnancy pill so that the endometriosis comes back. And obviously the pregnancy pill is going to keep you from getting pregnant. And so we just kind of went with that and continued to go through that process. And at the end of that 4 months, I'm going, God, this is what you said. You opened the door. We went through all of that, and now she's still not pregnant. What's going on? And I remember being really frustrated and going, God, it feels like we're just waiting and waiting and waiting. And I know what you said, but we're waiting and waiting and waiting. And I was driving home, and all of a sudden it just hit me, God, if this is what you promised, then you're going to do it. You can make a child appear from nowhere if you want to. And I thought of the story of Abraham and God telling him that he wanted him to sacrifice him on the altar. And God said, and Abraham trusting God so much and knowing that even if he had to do that, that God could raise him back up from the dead. And I thought, God, you can provide a child for us from anywhere, from any situation. You can make a child appear out of nowhere. And so if you said that we're going to have a child this year, then we're going to have a child this year one way or another. And then all of a sudden it hit me that I hadn't finished the nursery. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go home and finish the nursery. And so I went home and just continued to work on the nursery and began to get that finished. And it took me a couple weeks to get that done. At the end of that couple of weeks, we had a meeting with our doctor, and she said, okay, it's come to that point of where we need to set you up with a fertility specialist. And so we're going to make the phone calls to do that. And so Tenielle and I went home, and we thought, okay, now this is the next chapter. We have to get ready for this part, whatever this looks like. Until Tenielle called me while I was coming home from work and said, Sean, I think you might need to get a pregnancy test. And so I went to the store, and we got the pregnancy test and went home. And before we ever had a chance to even talk to a fertility specialist, we found out that Tenielle was pregnant. And now here in my arms, 9 months later, we've got this little guy that is proof that God does exactly what he says he's going to do. And so you can know beyond a shadow of doubt that if God promised you something, he is going to fulfill it, because he's a good God, he's a good daddy, and he will do what he promises to do. So God bless you guys. I'm anxious for you to meet this little dude. We're going to be in the hospital the next day or so, just kind of hanging out with him and letting him do his thing. But here's proof of God's promises. Asher Holden Niles.